The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling glass of Azure Heights Tech, but it offered no warmth to David Miller. He stood at the edge of the open-plan office, his fingers tracing the frayed cuff of a suit jacket that had seen better decades. Around him, the air hummed with the sterile, expensive scent of high-end espresso and the aggressive clicking of mechanical keyboards. At 45, David felt like a ghost haunting his own creation. He watched the younger developers, barely out of college and wearing sneakers that cost more than his monthly rent, move with a frantic, desperate energy. They didn't look at him. To them, he was just a relic, a piece of office furniture that happened to breathe. David took a deep breath, clutching a manila envelope. Inside was his monthly paycheck, or what was left of it. He walked toward the corner office, the one with the heavy oak doors that felt like a barrier between two different worlds. He didn't have to knock. The door swung open as Sarah, the CEO's executive assistant, stepped out. She didn't stop, didn't offer a greeting, and certainly didn't look him in the eye. Instead, she let out a sharp, performative sigh, checking her rose gold smartwatch while shifting a $5,000 leather briefcase to her other arm. David offered a small, polite nod, but she simply rolled her eyes, her heels clicking a rhythmic, condescending beat against the marble floor as she walked past him. Inside the office, the atmosphere was suffocatingly cold. Mr. Zhang was seated behind a desk that looked like a slab of polished obsidian. He didn't look up from his tablet, his thumb flicking across the screen with a predatory precision. Zhang had arrived 3 months ago from Shanghai, carrying the reputation of a vulture investor, a man who didn't build companies so much as he harvested them for parts. He prided himself on what he called lean excellence, which in reality meant cutting the legs out from under anyone he deemed too expensive or too old. David cleared his throat, his voice steady but quiet. "Mr. Zhang, do you have a moment? I think there's been a clerical error with my direct deposit." Zhang didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, a power move designed to make David feel the weight of his own insignificance. Finally, Zhang leaned back, his sharp features twisting into a smirk that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Ah, David, our senior dinosaur. I was wondering when you'd crawl in here." David set the pay stub on the obsidian desk. "My contract specifies a fixed salary, Mr. Zhang. This check is 40% lower than the agreed amount. I've put in 60 hours a week this month, including the server migration on Sunday." Zhang picked up the paper with 2 fingers, as if it were a piece of soiled trash. He didn't look at the numbers. He looked at David's faded tie. "Contract? David, you Americans are so obsessed with pieces of paper. In my world, value is earned every single day. Look at you. You're slow. Your ideas are dusty. I'm bringing in hungry kids from overseas who work twice as hard for a fraction of what you think you're worth. To be honest, you should be grateful I'm paying you at all. Consider the reduction a convenience fee for the fact that I haven't fired you yet." The injustice of it felt like a physical blow to David's chest, but he kept his hands at his sides. "I've been with this firm since the garage days, sir. I wrote the core logic that runs our primary platform." Zhang stood up, his expensive suit jacket settling perfectly on his shoulders. He walked around the desk, leaning in close enough for David to smell his citrusy, overpriced cologne. "The garage days are over, David. This is my kingdom now. In my country, we don't pay for slow legs. We put them out to pasture." He reached for a white ceramic mug on his desk, filled with a steaming latte. With a casual, almost bored flick of his wrist, Zhang tilted the mug. David watched in slow motion as the hot, milky liquid poured directly onto his desk, soaking into a small, framed photograph of a woman with a kind smile. It was the only personal item David kept at work, the last photo of his wife before the illness took her. The CEO let out a short, dry laugh, watching the brown liquid stain the image. "Oops, my hand slipped. Since you aren't busy doing anything productive, why don't you clean that up? Maybe if you do a good job, I'll find some spare change in my pockets for you." Zhang turned his back, already dismissing him. "Now get out. You're polluting the air in here." David stared at the ruined photo, his heart drumming a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He simply reached down and picked up the wet frame, his eyes shifting from a dull weariness to a cold, sharp clarity. The storm hadn't just begun, it had finally arrived. The fluorescent lights of the modern office seemed to flicker and fade, replaced by the warm, flickering yellow of a single bare bulb hanging from a grease-stained ceiling. 20 years ago, the air didn't smell of expensive lattes and ozone. It smelled of gasoline, burnt solder, and the metallic tang of ambition. A much younger David Miller, his hands blackened with engine oil and his eyes bright with a feverish intensity, sat hunched over a makeshift desk made of plywood and cinder blocks. This was the birthplace of Azure Logic. There were no glass walls here, only the corrugated metal of a rented garage in a neighborhood where people kept their doors double-locked. Beside him sat his original partners, men who had long since cashed out or moved on, but David had been the soul of the operation. He had spent 18 hours a day coding the original architecture, his fingers flying across a mechanical keyboard until his joints throbbed. He remembered the night he cracked the encryption that would eventually make the company billions. He hadn't celebrated with champagne, he had celebrated with a 99-cent can of beans and a silent prayer of thanks. He wasn't building a company for the money, he was building a legacy, a dream where talent and hard work meant something. The memories shifted like sand in a desert wind, turning cold and sharp. Years later, when the company faced its first major crisis, a predatory hostile takeover that threatened to liquidate every employee's pension, David had made a choice that no one else would. He sat in a high-backed leather chair, a fountain pen trembling slightly in his hand. To save the livelihoods of the 500 families that worked for him, he had signed over his majority shares into a complex, blind trust. He stepped down from the throne he had built, voluntarily taking a mid-level position to stay close to the code and the people he loved. He had traded his crown for a cubicle, choosing to be a guardian in the shadows rather than a king in the light. But while David was building, others were plotting. In a parallel thread of time, a younger, more desperate Mr. Zhang was being escorted out of a mid-sized brokerage firm across the ocean. His face was twisted in a mask of wounded pride and venomous rage. He had been caught skimming accounts, a disgrace that would have ended most careers. But as the security guards shoved him toward the exit, Zhang didn't hang his head in shame. He turned back toward the gleaming skyscraper, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure, concentrated hate. One day, he had whispered to the cold wind, "I will own the men who think they are better than me. I will crush the builders and take their stones for my own palace." For Zhang, the world was not a place of creation, but a hunting ground where the loudest voice and the sharpest teeth won. The weight of those 2 decades crashed back into the present as David stood in the middle of the modern office, holding the ruined, coffee-stained photo of his late wife. The transition from the warmth of the past to the sterile cruelty of the present felt like being plunged into ice water. He looked down at the image of the woman who had stood by him in that garage, the woman whose medical bills had eventually drained the secret reserves he'd kept. He lived in a small, one-bedroom apartment now, eating simple meals and taking the bus, not because he had failed, but because he had chosen to use his remaining wealth to fund a pediatric wing at the local hospital. He was a man who owned a legacy but possessed nothing, while the man standing over him possessed everything but owned nothing of value. Across the room, Uncle Chen, the elderly janitor who moved like a shadow among the high-powered executives, paused his floor buffer. He didn't speak, but his gaze met David's. There was a flicker of recognition there, a silent understanding between 2 men who the world chose to ignore. Chen had seen the giants fall and the rats rise, and in David's eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in years. The spark of the man who had once built an empire out of plywood and dreams. David wiped a drop of latte from the glass of the picture frame with his thumb. The humiliation Zhang had tried to heap upon him didn't feel like a weight anymore, it felt like fuel. Zhang thought he was bullying a broken old man who was lucky to have a job. He had no idea he was poking a sleeping lion who still held the keys to the kingdom. David tucked the photo into his inner breast pocket, right against his heart. The past was a shadow, but the shadow was growing long, and it was about to swallow Mr. Zhang whole. The degradation did not stop with the pay cut. It became a systematic dismantling of David's dignity. On Monday morning, David arrived to find his belongings, the few that remained, crammed into a soggy cardboard box sitting on the floor outside his old office. Sarah, Zhang's assistant, stood over the mess, snapping her gum and checking a freshly manicured nail. She didn't look up, merely pointed a finger toward the back of the floor, past the gleaming break room and the rows of vibrant, young developers. "You're in the back now, Pops," she said with a dismissive flick of her wrist. "Mr. Zhang says the senior title was a bit of a stretch. You're junior support now." David walked to his new station. It wasn't a desk so much as a plastic folding table shoved into a cramped alcove directly next to the men's restroom. The air was thick with the scent of industrial bleach and the constant, rhythmic thud of the bathroom door swinging open and shut. His new neighbor was Brad, a 24-year-old lead developer who wore a smirk like it was part of the corporate uniform. Brad spent the morning loud talking on his headset, making sure David heard every word. "Yeah, the new boss is cleaning house, man," Brad laughed, leaning back in his ergonomic chair and kicking his expensive sneakers up on his desk. "Finally getting rid of the white dinosaurs. This guy next to me looks like he belongs in a retirement home, not a tech hub. He probably still uses a flip phone." The harassment escalated from whispers to a full-scale ambush by Thursday afternoon. The office fell silent as Mr. Zhang marched toward David's cramped corner, followed by a trail of curious onlookers and a very grim-looking HR director, Mark. Zhang's face was a mask of calculated fury. He slammed a tablet down onto David's folding table, the loud crack echoing off the tiled bathroom walls. "Explain this," Zhang barked, his voice loud enough to ensure every ear in the building was listening. "A massive security breach. Our proprietary encryption for the Shanghai contract was leaked to a server in Eastern Europe last night. The logs show it came from your terminal, David." David felt a cold prickle of alarm. "That's impossible, sir. I wasn't even logged in last night. I was at the hospital visiting." Zhang didn't let him finish. He turned to the crowd, his arms spread wide in a theatrical display of outrage. "You see? This is what happens when you keep the old and the incompetent. Their minds wander, they forget their passwords, or worse, they get bitter and sell us out. This white man's incompetence almost cost us $1 billion partnership." Mark, the HR director, stepped forward, his voice dripping with a fake, oily sympathy that made David's skin crawl. "David, we have the forensic logs. It's all here. Given the severity of the situation, we have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately. For cause. No severance. No benefits." Zhang leaned down, his eyes gleaming with the triumph of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. He whispered low enough that only David could hear, "I told you I would make sure you never work in this industry again. You are nothing but a ghost, and today, I'm exorcising you." Sarah stood nearby, her smartphone held high, recording the entire scene. She giggled as David slowly stood up, his face pale but his expression unreadable. Two burly security guards appeared behind him, their hands resting on their belts. They didn't just walk him to the door, they marched him through the center of the office like a common criminal. David clutched his cardboard box, the bottom beginning to sag from the dampness of the floor. He passed Brad, who made a mock crying gesture with his hands, and Mark, who looked away with a smug, knowing grin. As the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, the humid Seattle rain was already beginning to blur the city. The guards shoved him out into the gray afternoon, the heavy glass doors of Azure Heights Tech locking with a definitive, electronic click. David stood on the sidewalk, the rain soaking through his thin suit jacket, clutching the box that contained the remnants of 20 years of his life. Above him, he could see the faint silhouettes of people watching from the high-performance glass of the executive floor. He looked down at the box, then up at the towering monolith he had built from a garage. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply waited for the bus, his mind already beginning to weave the first threads of a trap that Mr. Zhang would never see coming. The neon sign of the Rusty Anchor diner flickered in the Seattle rain, casting a sickly yellow glow over the cracked pavement. David sat in the far corner booth, the air smelling of old grease and burnt coffee. He looked every bit the broken man Zhang wanted him to be, shoulders slumped, his cheap suit damp and clinging to his frame, staring vacantly at a cold cup of tea. His cardboard box sat on the vinyl seat across from him like a tombstone. To any passerby, he was just another casualty of the corporate machine, a man whose best days were decades behind him. The bell above the door chimed, and a gust of cold air followed a small, elderly man into the diner. It was Chen, the janitor from Azure Heights. He had shed his blue jumpsuit for a simple, clean windbreaker, his movements surprisingly fluid and sharp for a man of his age. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight to David's booth and slid into the seat opposite him. David didn't look up, but his voice was steady. "It's worse than I thought, Chen. They didn't just fire me. They're trying to bury my name." Chen didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, encrypted flash drive, sliding it across the table. "My son has been watching the accounts from the outside," Chen whispered, his English perfect and devoid of the feigned struggle he used at the office. "The blind trust you established 20 years ago, it isn't just a safety net for the employees, David. It's a cage for a man like Zhang. He thinks he's playing chess, but he doesn't realize you built the board." David's hand closed over the drive, and for the first time in months, his posture shifted. The weariness didn't disappear, but it transformed into something colder, something calculated. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Chen's with a terrifying clarity. The midpoint twist was finally in motion. Zhang hadn't just bullied a helpless employee, he had triggered the morality and ethics clause buried deep within the company's original charter. By discriminating against staff and falsifying records to terminate a legacy founder, Zhang had legally forfeited his right to lead. But more importantly, he had handed David the one thing he needed to reclaim the empire: a reason to stop being kind. "I played the victim long enough to see who the real snakes were," David said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its soft, apologetic edge. "Mark, Sarah, Brad, they all showed their hands. They think I'm filing for bankruptcy. They think I'm defeated. Let them. The news reports I leaked this morning will confirm their victory. I want Zhang to feel so safe that he gets sloppy. I want him to celebrate his triumph, while I take every brick out of the foundation." Chen nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "And the Phoenix Protocol?" David tapped the flash drive against the table. "It's the original back-end code, Chen. The logic I wrote in that garage. Zhang's team has spent months trying to reverse engineer it, but they'll never find the kill switch I hid in the kernel. I can shut down the entire network from a motel room with a single keystroke. But I'm not just going to turn off the lights. I'm going to let him stand on the grandest stage he can find, and then I'm going to let the world see him for exactly what he is." As David stood up, he left a $20 bill on the table, far more than the tea cost, and picked up his box. He no longer walked with a limp or a slouch. His gaze was fixed on the middle distance, seeing a future that didn't include Mr. Zhang. He wasn't the victim anymore, he was the architect of a masterpiece of ruin. The hunt had officially begun, and Zhang, for all his millions and his arrogance, was the only one who didn't know he was the prey. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in the art of the invisible war. While the world believed David Miller had vanished into the gray obscurity of failed ambitions, he was more present than ever, existing as a ghost in the very machine he had created. He worked out of a cramped motel room on the outskirts of the city, where the wallpaper was peeling and the air smelled of stale tobacco and cheap floor cleaner. It was a far cry from the glass towers of Azure Heights, but to David, it felt like the garage again. It felt like home. He sat before a bank of 3 high-end monitors, their blue light reflecting off his glasses, casting a sharp, predatory glow across his face. His fingers moved across the keyboard with a grace and speed that would have terrified Brad and the other young developers. He wasn't just coding, he was performing surgery. He navigated through the company's core servers, slipping past the firewalls Zhang's team had installed like a shadow through a keyhole. He knew the back doors because he had carved them himself 20 years ago, hidden in the kernel of the system. A fail-safe he had hoped he would never have to use. Meanwhile, 40 floors up in his penthouse office, Mr. Zhang was living a different reality. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, swirling a vintage cognac in a crystal glass, watching the sun set over the Seattle skyline. To him, the Miller problem had been solved. He had seen the fabricated news reports of David's bankruptcy and laughed. He felt invincible. He spent his afternoons on the phone with shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, finalizing the secret sale of the company's assets. Sarah stood nearby, her heels clicking as she moved about the room, organizing the final guest list for the upcoming 20th anniversary gala. She sneered as she deleted David's name from the historical archives of the company website. "He's officially a non-person, sir," she said, her voice dripping with a sycophantic sweetness. "Just a footnote in your legacy." Zhang chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering over pavement. "Efficiency is the only legacy that matters, Sarah. The world doesn't care about the man who laid the bricks. It only cares about the man whose name is on the front door." He was so blinded by his own reflection in the glass that he didn't notice the subtle flickers in his system's performance. He didn't see the tiny packets of data being rerouted to a remote motel room. He didn't see the silent meetings David was holding in the dead of night at local diners and park benches. David met with the people Zhang had trampled, the underpaid janitors, the dismissed secretaries, and the engineers whose salaries had been slashed to pad Zhang's bonuses. He didn't promise them a handout, he promised them justice. "I need you all to stay exactly where you are," David told them, his voice low and commanding. "Work your shifts. Take the insults. But when the clock hits 9 on Friday night, I want every one of you to step away from your stations. We aren't just quitting, we're reclaiming what's ours." As the days ticked down to the gala, David's physical transformation mirrored his digital one. He traded his oversized, frayed suit for a custom-tailored piece of navy wool he had kept in storage, a suit that cost more than Zhang's car. He began to run again, shedding the sluggish weight of his depression, his jawline sharpening as his resolve hardened. Every morning, he looked in the cracked motel mirror and saw the man who had built an empire. He wasn't just a developer anymore, he was a general. The trap was set. The legal documents were signed and notarized by Chen's son, a high-powered corporate litigator who had been working pro bono for months. The digital kill switch was armed. Zhang was planning a celebration of his own brilliance, unaware that he was merely setting the stage for his own public execution. David closed his laptop on the eve of the gala, the room falling into a heavy, expectant silence. He looked at the tailored suit hanging on the back of the door and then at the old, stained janitor's jacket Chen had given him. He would need both to finish this. The king was returning to his castle, but he would enter through the servants' entrance one last time. The grand ballroom of the Four Seasons was a dizzying spectacle of excess, illuminated by crystal chandeliers that cast a sharp, diamond-like glitter over Seattle's elite. Men in $5,000 tuxedos drifted through the crowd, their voices a low hum of polished networking, while women in silk gowns moved with a practiced elegance that masked their cold ambition. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sharp, citrusy sting of top-shelf gin. This was the 20th anniversary gala of Azure Heights Tech, but tonight, it felt more like a coronation. Mr. Zhang stood at the center of the room, the undisputed king of the mountain. He adjusted his silk bow tie in the reflection of a passing waiter's silver tray, his face lit with a smug, untouchable glow. Sarah hovered at his elbow like a loyal shadow, her eyes darting around the room, ensuring that every camera was pointed in their direction. She checked her phone and leaned in, whispering loud enough for several nearby investors to hear. "Everything is perfect, sir. The press is ready, and the new software demo is loaded. It's a shame the old guard couldn't be here to see what a real winner looks like." Zhang laughed, a sharp, barking sound that cut through the music. "The old guard is currently choosing between a park bench and a bus station, Sarah. We don't invite ghosts to the banquet." While the elite sipped champagne in the center of the room, David Miller entered through the heavy steel doors of the service corridor. He looked invisible, dressed in the oversized, stained janitor's jacket he had borrowed from Chen, with a tattered baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He blended perfectly with the catering staff and the cleaning crew. To the people in the tuxedos, he was just part of the scenery, a human tool to be ignored. He felt the weight of the custom-tailored navy suit beneath the jacket, the heavy silk fabric a secret armor against the coldness of the room. He carried a plastic bucket and a mop, moving slowly toward the back of the stage where the massive LED screens were being tested. He passed Brad, who was standing near the tech booth, bragging to a group of young interns. "Yeah, I'm the one who finally purged the legacy bugs," Brad said, puffing out his chest. "The guy before me was a total dinosaur. He couldn't even handle a simple security patch. I heard he's begging for change down on 4th Street now." David didn't flinch. He kept his head down, his mop rhythmically striking the floor. He reached the shadow of the great stage just as the lights began to dim. The orchestra finished their set with a flourish, and a hush fell over the ballroom. A single, powerful spotlight pierced the darkness, finding Mr. Zhang as he strode toward the microphone with the practiced confidence of a man who believed he had won the world. "Welcome, everyone, to the future," Zhang's voice boomed, amplified by a $1 million sound system. 20 years ago, this company was a small, stumbling operation. But under my leadership, we have trimmed the dead weight. We have carved away the slow and the weak to reveal the diamond beneath. Tonight, I show you the new face of Azure Heights. David stood in the wings, his hand reaching into his pocket to find the small, black remote Chen had given him. He looked out at the sea of faces, the people who had watched him get dragged out by security, the people who had laughed at his demotion, the people who had forgotten his name. He felt a strange, cold peace. Zhang continued his speech, his gestures becoming more theatrical. "We are about to launch an AI platform so advanced, it will make our competitors look like they're using stone tools. And we did it by demanding excellence. By realizing that in this industry, there is no room for sentimentality. There is only room for the best." Sarah stood at the edge of the stage, her phone raised to capture the moment of her boss's triumph. She caught a glimpse of the janitor standing just a few feet away and hissed under her breath. "Hey, you, move back into the kitchen. You're ruining the shot." David didn't move. He looked Sarah directly in the eye, and for a split second, she froze. There was something in his gaze that didn't belong to a janitor, a piercing, regal authority that made her heart skip a beat in sudden, inexplicable fear. Then, David reached up and began to unbutton the stained blue jacket. As the heavy fabric fell to the floor, revealing the sharp, impeccable lines of the most expensive suit in the room, the digital clock on the wall hit exactly 9 p.m. The air in the ballroom seemed to vanish. David stepped out from the shadows, not as a servant, but as the architect returning to his temple. The lights on the stage flickered once, then turned a deep, blood red. The silence that swept through the grand ballroom was not a quiet thing. It was a physical weight, heavy and suffocating. On the massive 80-foot LED screens behind Mr. Zhang, the vibrant, colorful graphics of the new software launch vanished in a glitchy strobe of red and black. In their place, a grainy, high-definition video began to loop. It was the footage from Zhang's office. The hidden camera on David's button had captured every second of the coffee being poured, the ruined photo of David's late wife, and Zhang's voice, cold and metallic, sneering about slow legs and white dinosaurs. The elite of Seattle watched in a state of paralysis as the man on stage was revealed to be not a visionary, but a playground bully with a corporate title. Zhang spun around, his face draining of color until it matched the starched white of his tuxedo shirt. His jaw hung open, his tongue darting out to lick dry lips as he stared at his own cruelty broadcast to the most powerful people in the country. This is a fabrication," he shrieked, his voice cracking and jumping an octave. "It's a deepfake. Security, remove this trash from the stage." He pointed a trembling finger at David, who was now standing at the center of the platform, the light catching the razor-sharp lines of his navy suit. But the security guards didn't move. They stood like statues at the edge of the room, their arms folded. Uncle Chen's son, dressed in a sharp black legal suit, stepped onto the stage holding a thick leather-bound folio. He didn't look at Zhang, he looked at the crowd. "My name is Michael Chen, lead counsel for the Miller Blind Trust. Under the original 2004 Charter of Azure Heights Tech, Section 12, Paragraph 4, the Morality and Ethics Clause, any majority shareholder or executive found guilty of systematic discrimination or the falsification of corporate records to terminate a founding member forfeits all equity and operational control. Effective 60 seconds ago, the Phoenix Protocol was triggered. Mr. Zhang, you aren't just fired. You are a trespasser in a building you no longer own. The room erupted in a low, thunderous murmur. Sarah, who had been recording the event for social media, slowly lowered her phone, her hand shaking so hard it rattled. She looked at David, then at the police officers who were now entering from the back of the hall. Brad, sitting in the front row, tried to shrink into his seat, his smug arrogance replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. David stepped toward the microphone. The timid, apologetic tone he had used for months was gone. His voice was a baritone rumble that filled every corner of the ballroom, carrying the weight of 20 years of silence. You told me I was a ghost, Zhang. You told me that in your world, value is earned every day. He paused, letting the words hang in the air like a guillotine. Well, today is your day of reckoning. I didn't build this company with coffee spills and insults. I built it with the sweat of people you called dead wood. I built it with the brilliance of engineers you underpaid to buy your cognac. David turned to face Zhang fully, his shadow stretching long across the stage. You thought you could come here and harvest what you didn't plant. But you forgot one thing about this industry. We don't just build software. We build systems of logic. And in logic, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. You call it efficiency. I call it karma. Zhang let out a guttural scream of rage and lunged toward David, his fingers clawed like a cornered animal. But he was met halfway by two officers. They spun him around, the cold metallic click of handcuffs echoing through the silent room. He began to sob, a pathetic, high-pitched sound, as he was forced to his knees in front of the man he had called a dinosaur. He looked up at David, his eyes begging for a mercy he had never shown. David didn't look down with hate, he looked down with a profound, quiet pity. Sarah and Brad were quickly surrounded by legal investigators, their laptops and phones seized as evidence of the forged security breach logs. The crowd, sensing the shift in power, began to applaud, not for a CEO, but for the man who had regained his soul. David walked to the edge of the stage, looking out past the billionaires and the cameras. He saw Uncle Chen standing in the back, leaning on his mop with a proud, knowing smile. David gave him a single, solemn nod. The king was back, but the kingdom was finally going to belong to the people who actually built the walls. The flash of the police cruiser's lights faded into the rainy Seattle night, leaving a heavy, contemplative silence in the grand ballroom. Mr. Zhang was gone, his legacy reduced to a set of fingerprints and a felony fraud charge that would ensure he spent the next decade in a concrete cell far away from crystal chandeliers. Sarah and Brad had been escorted out shortly after, their reputations so thoroughly dismantled that even a search engine wouldn't be able to find a version of them that wasn't synonymous with corporate villainy. The old guard, as Zhang had called them, didn't celebrate with the loud, abrasive arrogance of their predecessors. Instead, there was a quiet, communal exhale of relief. David Miller stood by the window of his old office the following morning, watching the fog roll off the sound. The space felt different now. The obsidian desk was gone, replaced by a large, circular wooden table designed for collaboration rather than intimidation. He had spent the early hours of the morning signing the paperwork to convert Azure Heights Tech into a worker-owned cooperative. Every employee, from the senior architects to the janitorial staff, now held a stake in the company's future. His first act as the restored chairman was to issue back pay to every person Zhang had exploited, with a 20% integrity bonus added for those who had stood their ground. 5 years passed with the steady, quiet rhythm of a life well lived. The company thrived, not through fear, but through a radical culture of kindness and mutual respect. David rarely wore the $10,000 suit anymore, preferring the comfortable sweaters and worn jeans of a man who had nothing left to prove to the world. He spent most of his time at the Miller Pediatric Center, the hospital wing he had finally completed in his wife's honor. He liked to sit in the garden there, watching the children play, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face and the weight of a clear conscience in his heart. One Tuesday afternoon, while walking through the city's downtown core to catch the bus, a habit he never quite gave up, David spotted a man huddled in a recessed doorway near a shuttered tech firm. The man was wearing a tattered, filth-streaked jacket that had once been expensive wool, his hair matted and his eyes unfocused. It was Zhang. He had been released early on parole, penniless and blacklisted from every corner of the global economy. He was holding a cardboard sign that read, "Hungry, please help," though most people stepped over him as if he were nothing more than a glitch in the sidewalk. David stopped. He didn't feel the surge of triumph he might have expected years ago. Instead, he felt a profound, weary sadness. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a $20 bill, leaning down to place it gently in the man's shaking hand. Zhang looked up, his eyes widening as he recognized the face of the man he had tried to destroy. He began to stammer, his voice a raspy shadow of the arrogant roar it once was. But David simply placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to say anything," David said softly. "Just use it to get a warm meal. Everyone deserves a second chance, even if they never gave one to anyone else." As David walked away, the city humming around him, he thought about the long, winding road that had led him from a garage to a skyscraper and back to the simple dignity of a quiet life. He realized then that karma isn't a weapon used to hurt people. It's a mirror that eventually shows us the truth of our own souls. The world is a vast, complicated place, but the rules that govern it are remarkably simple. You can build an empire on a foundation of greed and call it efficiency, but eventually, the weight of your own cruelty will bring the ceiling down. Kindness is the only currency that never devalues. It is the only investment that returns 1,000-fold when you least expect it. As David boarded his bus and found a seat by the window, he looked at his reflection in the glass and smiled. He wasn't a ghost, and he wasn't a dinosaur. He was a man who knew that you should never judge a book by its cover, because the most humble person in the room might just be the one who owns the building. True power doesn't come from how many people you can step on to get to the top. It comes from how many people you are willing to lift up along the way.